So, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou. Kei te waikato I whakatapu au, no kirikiri roa ahau, ko Jennifer Curtin toko ingoa, tēnā koutou katoa. So welcome everyone out there in webinar land to our second Gender Impact Analysis Forum, sponsored by the Public Policy Institute, but also by our Gender Responsive Analysis and Budgeting project here at the PPI. We held our first forum on the impact of COVID-19 on women as paid workers in late May, and you can find the recording of that policy that policy forum on our Policy Commons and our Gender Responsive Analysis website. We also know that our women's organisations have been really busy and active in championing the issues we care about over the last 3 weeks in the media, post-budget in particular, and it's really great to see. So for those of you out there listening, thank you for your efforts on behalf of all of us in this space, working in this space. Today's Gender Impact Analysis Forum builds on our last one by focusing on women's paid work. In tough times, women's claims historically for access to the labour market, but also to equal pay, have often been sidelined. And now our economy is coming under pressure again. It may be really easy for these issues of equal pay, pay equity and pay transparency to be overlooked or to be sidelined further. We also know from early evidence that's coming out of the US that remote working has a real strong possibility of exacerbating the gender pay gap that already exists, quite significantly actually, so another thing to watch. So to discuss what we need to focus on to keep women's claims to equal pay, pay equity and just, you know, earning more than the minimum wage on the decision-making table, we've got 4 expert speakers with us today. So we have the Honourable Julianne Genter, Minister for Women, kia ora. Loris Park, Mātua Tākawainga from the New Zealand Education Institute. David McLean, Chief Executive of Westpac, and Zoe Brownlee, the Gender TIC Director of the YWCA and ADHB representative. So we've asked each of these speakers to speak for 8 to 10 minutes each on their take on these issues. I'll wave my red phone at 8 minutes. You as an audience can ask questions by typing into the Q&A column or text box, and you can also upvote. So that's ticking other people's questions. So they will rise then if they're questions that you're interested in having answered to the top of the list. I just remind you that the audience that we're recording this, so just for your information to be aware that this will be recorded and posted on the Policy Commons website after the event for those who are not able to join us today. The Minister needs to leave at 1:30, but if you've got questions for her that you feel don't get answered by other speakers and you would like us, don't be shy about putting those questions up. We'll be collating those and forwarding them to her office, and we will post answers to those questions after the event. So without further ado, I'd like to ask the Minister to open our conversation today. Kia ora.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. It's really wonderful to be able to join in this conversation with a fantastic panel, and I just want to thank you, Professor Curtin, for hosting this conversation. I think it's really important, obviously. And the way that I'll set out what I'm going to say is I'll run through some of the statistics, which some of you may already be really aware of, just to lay out the scale of the problem and how it might be impacted by COVID-19. This is advice I've gotten from the Ministry for Women. And then I'll lay out what the government has been doing on pay equity and equal pay, and what more I think that we need to do to see significant progress in this area. Historically, women have been disproportionately affected by downturns in the labor market. All of those existing structural inequities, like the gender pay gap and the occupational segregation, where it's predominantly men in higher paid positions in construction and predominantly women in those caring professions like teaching and nursing and midwifery, means that women generally have less discretionary income and less savings than men do. So they're more vulnerable to financial shocks, just like the one that's being posed by the impacts of COVID-19. And these shocks will be especially felt by women who already experience those intersecting forms of discrimination, such as single mothers on low incomes, wahine Māori, and Pacifica women. And in many ways, it feels like this discussion is just what I've been saying the entire term I've been Minister for Women about what we need to do to get better outcomes for women, but even more so now, because the nature of the COVID-19 economic impact has been that it's predominantly female or industries where women are working that are more likely to be impacted by the downturn. If you look at retail, hospitality, tourism business, they actually employ more women than men. And of course, the levers that government has traditionally leaned on to provide economic stimulus, like building things, infrastructure, those are predominantly male-dominated industries. So because New Zealand's labor force is highly segregated by industry and gender, with women more likely to work in lower paid jobs and perform non-standard forms of work, that means women are more vulnerable. But of course, just as it's always the case, Māori women already were experiencing unemployment at over double the rate for women overall. This trend had been starting to change. It had been trending downwards, but we just need to be really aware in our response to COVID-19 and the economic impact of it, that we have a real focus on wahine Māori, Pacifica women, and those lowest paid workers. And then the vast majority of sole parents, who I think were probably particularly in a difficult position during the lockdown, and that, now that schools have reopened, maybe things are a little bit better, but the vast majority of sole parents in New Zealand are women. And the majority of children living in poverty are in sole parent households who are reliant on a benefit. So there's all these different ways in which women are more impacted, even though overseas it's been the case that the illness itself seems to affect men, and men are more likely to die from it. I did see some statistics in New Zealand where that wasn't true. That wasn't the case. It was actually slightly more women were getting it. But definitely the frontline workers throughout the lockdown were more likely to be women, and in the health sector, predominantly women. So they were more likely to be exposed while the illness was still an issue. So I just think, look, we wanted a fair, equal society anyway. We wanted to undo those decades or centuries of discrimination against women, the impacts of colonization, which have led to extremely unfair outcomes for Māori and Pacifica women, and the ongoing sort of discrimination that affects other women of color. So government needs to make that a priority. And some of the things our government was doing are helpful in that respect, like lifting the minimum wage. That helps everyone, but it happens that it's more likely to be women who are earning the minimum wage or in that more precarious casual work. And so they are benefiting from lifting the minimum wage. There's still more that we need to do in that area. Closing the gender pay gap. New Zealand's gender pay gap is now at 9.3%, and is one of the smallest, it's one of the smallest gaps recorded since the series began, but we know the pay gap's still massive for Māori and Pacifica women, Asian women, women with disabilities, close to 20% in some cases. And the gender pay gap for Māori women is approximately double the overall gap. So the government set out to resolve this through our own role as an employer initially. So government employs a lot of people directly. We set out our Eliminating the Gender Pay Gap in the Public Service Action Plan, and that has seen progress. In the last year, we saw 1.7% percentage point decrease in the public sector gender pay gap, which was the biggest decrease since 2002, and it was tied for the biggest decrease ever. And we had an even bigger reduction in the pay gap for Māori and Pacifica women employed in the public service. But we need to do much more. And I really want to shout out to the businesses who are involved in being, leaders, champions for change, like Westpac, doing good work. But ultimately, I think this is one of those collective problems that can't just be solved by individual organizations. Everybody has to do their bit, and we need government setting the rules so that people cannot be discriminated against. We want everybody to have a shot at fair pay and avoiding gender-based or other types of discrimination, no matter who they're employed by. We have a big lever being an employer, but we also need to make sure that the rules are ensuring that no employer, intentionally or unintentionally, is carrying out this type of systemic discrimination that is disadvantaging women, Māori women, Pacifica women, other women of color, women with disabilities. Pay equity is one route that government has been progressing to enable workers in industries that have been predominantly women to get fair pay. And there's been a successful case. The care and support workers, won their case in the courts and are on a pathway to fair pay. And so we've been working on an equal pay amendment bill, which will set out this pathway based on bargaining. It's really been the unions who have led this work, and I want to acknowledge the unions for their work, so that we have a clear pathway and make it easy for workers in these historically female-dominated industries to have a pathway to negotiate a pay equity settlement. And we need that to be based on best practice. We need to make sure it works for all women, not just women in unions. Unfortunately, New Zealand doesn't have a very highly unionized workforce once you get out of the public sector and a few other areas. So we need to make sure that this is accessible to all women. And so finally, I'd say the next step has to be introducing some type of pay transparency. And that means that large employers would have to record, all large employers would have to record their gender pay gap and publish it in some way, or make it be known and available to people. And of course, New Zealand's behind on this. I mean, Australia's done it, the UK has done it, Iceland, many other countries have mechanisms by which that transparency can be there for workers so they know what's going on. And that provides the incentive to do something about it. And I know there are some private companies who are leading the way on this, and Westpac measured their pay gap and published it, and good on them for doing that. And I believe Spark did as well. A few other large companies are doing that. Government is doing it. We've been publishing our pay gaps for ages. It's not difficult to do. It's not something that I think there's any good reason not to do, other than we have to do the work to determine exactly what the mechanism is, what is the reporting mechanism, how is it going to be shared, to make sure that it can't be gamed and that everybody agrees that it's collecting fair information. But I think it's something that will really benefit women, and particularly those women who are the most discriminated against. I'm running short on time, but I just want to say I'm also really aware that there are other steps that government could take to address these systemic inequities, but these are the ones that we're focused on right now. So kia ora koutou, and thank you.
Kia ora, thank you, Julianne. That was great, and I think people will definitely want to hear more about how pay transparency rules need to be put in place, and what we need to do to be encouraging government to help get those up. But in the meantime, it gives me great pleasure to now invite Loris to talk with us on this topic. Loris.
Kia ora tātou. Ko matawhaura te maunga, ko hau te awa, ko Ngāti Piki o te iwi. Ko Loris Parker hau, I mahi au I roto I NZI Te Reuroa. My name is Loris Park and I work for NZI Te Reuroa, the Union for Primary Principals, Primary Teachers, Early Childhood Teachers, Teachers' Aides, support staff generally across the sector, and also for some members we have in places like Kohanga and Tauira in colleges. What I thought I would talk about was partly about the Teachers' Aid claim, the pay equity claim that was taken, and more to explain the amount of work that has to go into one of these claims, because it's not a matter of make a claim, go to the government on it, have a little bit of a conversation about it, and it's all on. Actually, this began in 2016, and the claim was taken to the government to talk about the possibility of 22,000 teachers' aides who were being paid not to the value of the work that they do. So the first step in the whole exercise was actually to work out exactly what that work was. So this is in order that it could be compared with industries that are dominantly male and actually have similar kinds of mahi. So that interviewing process took a huge amount of time and a huge amount of work from people in the background that were able to do that. Then there was the process of looking for comparators. We had to look for comparators who were male in industries that had similar skills, and might I tell you, that was not the easiest exercise in the world. So when we did find the comparators, we then had to get the agreement from their unions that it was all right to compare with them. So having got that far along the process, then there were all the other things that were related. How was this going to happen? Where would this be part of their agreement round? Would this be part of, and so it went on, all the other things that went on, which in the background, Julianne would be quite aware, there were all the other legal things that were going on at the same time, and the discussions back and forth. So last week, finally, all the way through COVID, this was happening. We were discussing this with the Secretary for Education and also the Minister about all the ducks were in the row. Can we sign now? Are we ready for this? Is the money there? And so on. So last week, or near the end of last week, we started on the whole process now of informing all our membership. And also the other thing in this too, this wasn't just our members. This was also non-members that were involved in this whole exercise and are still involved in it. And so they will, all in the processes of the webinars and the information gathering and the talking to them, they have to be involved in that as well. And actually we're doing that as well. So it's members and non-members are being spoken to about what they need to do, where they need to go, what discussions they need to have with their principals and so on. And so it, moves them through the process. They can potentially, let me just look at the paper that says this. Potentially, the new rate ranges from $21.20 to $34.68 an hour. So, when you say it quickly, people think, oh, okay, that doesn't sound too bad. But actually, when you think about it, for an hour, you get an extra $14. That's an awful lot of money. But in the process, the teachers' aides have to look at the levels that they're on. So there's an ABC, and the D has been wiped out, ABC, and they have to then state which level they're on. As well as that, a matrix was developed with all the permutations of their work, so they can then look at all of those and decide which part that they fit on that. So a lot of happy people, a lot of pleased people, and a lot of exhausted people. Because as you can well understand, one of the people that was on television actually said, now I can buy a washing machine and I don't have to go to the laundromat every week. Now I can ensure that I go to the doctor too, as well as my children. So all of those things that seem small to other people are huge, as Julianne was saying, to the people who are single parent families. So all of these things are the things that now they can afford to do, not everything, but a little bit of luxury, so that you don't go from your teacher's aide job to a cleaning job or to another packing shelves job in order that you can feed your family. So this whole pay equity exercise for those people has meant that they now can actually access things that they otherwise would not be able to do for their children. So in the time that I have left to me, I wanted to also talk about kaiarahi te reo. Kaiarahi te reo are the, and I'm focusing particularly on Māori because there are two other claims that we have in process at the moment. Kaiarahi te reo are the next group of Māori people that we will be sponsoring through this whole exercise. Similar exercise that teachers' aides that happen. Kaiarahi te reo are supporters of te reo Māori in classes in primary and secondary schools. There are only 70 of them in the world. I'm saying the world because it's Aotearoa, of course. And so for them, that would actually, we need to go through that whole process of evidence gathering, of finding comparators to work with them. These are people that are actually have, these are people that have everything in their, sorry, I've just killed myself. These are people who have actually got everything in their fluent speakers of te reo Māori. They sit along the children in the classes. They do all that work, but the amount of money they are being paid is untrained teachers. So with all the skills that they have, they still continue to do the work that they're doing, but not valued at what they should be valued at. So they're the group we're looking at next. And alongside them are the administrators that we're talking about, who are in every school, a different group of support staff. And then the third group of people we're looking at supporting are kohanga reo teachers. Now, kohanga reo is a whole different ball game because it is early childhood, and even though there is no acknowledgement at their early childhood, they are therefore promoting te reo Māori. And what we are concerned about is having pay equity for those people who actually teach in the classroom, but actually don't even get the minimum wage. You would have seen the budget say that there's an allocation of funding for them, and in that allocation of funding, they will then move to the minimum wage. Some of these people have been teaching in kohanga for 20 years, and they are now moving to $20 an hour. And I mean, that is just criminal in my book. And so they can now move to the $20 an hour limit because they will be allocated that funding. But the unfairness of it is, where do they go to from there? So minimum, what about the living wage? You know, that's $2 more. Surely we can look towards that level of funding for those. So they're the next group that we're working with, looking at, and maybe actually looking at developing progress for them as well. So, kia ora.
Kia ora, Loris. That was great, and a very complex process to walk us through. And you know, it sounds like you must have have to have a team of researchers and evidence gatherers at your fingertips, which I'm sure is not actually the case, because most, so a lot of mahi involved. So well done, you and your team. I'd like to hand over now to David. Off you go.
Kia ora tātou, and I'm sorry to have to switch from the world of Te Ao Māori and education from Loris to the rather dry world of banking and business. But just to talk about our story, 18 months ago, I asked what our gender pay gap was in Westpac, New Zealand, and I was told it was 30.3%. And when I recovered consciousness, I determined to work out why that was and try to fix it. It was a really shocking number for us. When we analysed and understood our problem, the reason part of the reason it was really shocking was that we have pay equity, and we'd measured pay equity for quite a long time. So role by role across the organisation and layer by layer by layer across the organisation, we have pay equity almost exactly. And we also have things like 51.6% of our leaders in the bank are women. And we've been on this journey for quite a while. To find out that we had such a huge gender pay gap was, as I said, shocking. So why is that? Why is that? Well, for a start, we have majority of our staff are women. So we have 62% of our staff are women. And for the sort of reasons that I think the Minister talked about, we have far more women than men in roles in the bank that are frontline customer-facing roles, like in branches and in call centres. And we have far more men than women in specialised roles traditionally dominated by men, such as IT, foreign exchange trading, economics, and in more senior, highly paid management positions. So when you line them all up on a spreadsheet and you work out all the men and all the women ranked by order of how much they're paid, the median man in Westpac is paid 30.3% more than the median woman. And I should say thank you to the Minister for calling out Westpac, and I hope people didn't get the impression that we were somehow great at this. What this shows is that we're not great at it, but we're willing to talk about our challenges. So what are we going to do about it? Well, there's a number of things. First of all, things that we can do as an organisation. One of them is try to do things which create barriers to women progressing into more highly paid roles. So things like, we were the first bank to commit to paying the living wage. Other banks have now followed us, and in fact, confidentially, the bank, not to go past the internet here, but the Bankers Association is working to try to make banking the first industry to pay a living wage in New Zealand, and that should come out soon. It's been held up a bit by COVID. And for the living wage, for us, all of our staff are already paid the living wage, but we had to look at our third-party suppliers like cleaners, security guards, cafe staff and things, and they weren't. So about 500 staff were lifted to the living wage, paid by those other organisations who support us. We've done a lot of work with, things like the gender tick organisation that Zoe runs, to get the gender tick, and that's a whole lot of stuff about flexible working, parental leave, trying to remove those little barriers that get in the way. Things like becoming DV free. So domestic violence is something that actually is a big problem faced by women in New Zealand that men don't usually have to deal with as victims, and the workplace is a place that sometimes is the only place that women can feel safe because they're out of the clutches of the perpetrator. So that is something that employers need to think about what they can do to help their staff cope with that. So we've done those sort of things, but probably the bigger thing I'm committed to doing is talking about it, measuring it, and committing to measure it every year, and committing to hold ourselves to account to do that. And interestingly, when I've talked to other corporates, there was initially quite a low level of understanding of what the gender pay gap is. People think it's hard to measure. They think it's a national level thing that doesn't, affect individual corporates. And a lot of them feel that there's sort of particular situations affecting their industry. If you're heavily dominated by engineering, for example, that's some historical thing that's hard to shift. But the Champions for Change organisation that the Minister mentioned is one where there's about 30-something large corporates. We are committed to measuring our gender pay gaps internally and eventually to report on them. Spark, Air New Zealand and Genesis already have reported, along with Westpac, and maybe some others as well, and actually none of our numbers are great. Some of them sort of fudge their numbers a little bit, but they're not good numbers, which does make me wonder about New Zealand's 9.3. I think there's a danger in saying that we're 9.3% gender pay gap and feeling somehow complacent that we're at the top, almost near the top of the world charts. Actually, I think there's probably more embedded problems in New Zealand than that number would indicate. But the biggest issue, I think, that really affects us and affects the country is this issue that the Minister mentioned again, occupational segregation. Either one or both of two factors. One factor is that many jobs in New Zealand are traditionally dominated by men or women. We have quite a high level in New Zealand of occupational segregation. So that means that in certain jobs, they're dominated by one gender or another, much more than some other Western countries. And that is a thing that is just constantly being perpetuated. Little kids who are being born today, will kind of grow up, and if they're male, will be thinking, I want to be an astronaut, and if they're female, they'll somehow be steered to being, more of an air hostess or something, So, this occupational segregation is still alive and it's still persisting. So that is one thing we need to work on. And the second thing is that roles that were traditionally performed more by women have been underpaid. The work has been undervalued. Both of those things are kind of bigger than any one organisation like ours can fix. But we need to talk about them as a country and deal with them. And I agree with the Minister that one of the biggest, most powerful tools we have is transparency. The sort of naming and shaming, forcing people to publish their data, and the public holding them to account. We've seen this, for example, I think a good example of that was with the wage subsidy. Merely by putting the wage subsidy applicants up on the internet meant that we could tap into people wanting to look them, and that publicity was a very good disinfectant. So, as I said, we're not in a great space. We've got issues, but we're determined to try and fix them. I'm getting the message, Jennifer. Thank you very much.
Kia ora, David. I wasn't waving at you. I was waving at the Minister because she has to go now. So,
okay, good.
Kia ora, thank you, Minister, for being with us. And we'll be back in touch with you with some leftover questions. Thank you, David. That was really great. And so I apologise for cutting you short if that's what I did. But I think you're right about the occupational segregation, and it actually speaks to couple of the questions that have already started to come up about, given the nature, if you like, of occupational segregation, how we can encourage more women or more organisations that are involved in the rebuild, that work and that are engaged in the traditional kind of physical infrastructure work, if you like, to be recruiting women into those sectors, and also how we support women to get into those sectors if that's what their aspirations are. But before we move to answering those kinds of questions, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Zoe. Kia ora, Zoe. We're in your hands.
Kia ora te whānau, ka pupui te hao tarawhiti matia e te maunga o Kaukau, e rere ana nā wai o te whanganui a Tāra, ka rongoa ho e te mori o Papatuanuku, ko Zoe tōku ingoa, he ori ho no kotorana me era rangi. It is such a pleasure to be here, so thank you so much, Jennifer, for the invitation. I'm so excited to be chatting about this topic and trying to ignite some fires to make some change, continue to make some change. It's great to share this space with the other panelists. I absolutely tautoko everything that they've said. I want to make sure that the things that I'm talking about aren't just repeating what they're saying. So I've been furiously making notes as people have been speaking. So I'm the Gender Tech Director. So we work to support organisations to create gender equal workplaces, and I also sit on the Auckland District Health Board. There are a few areas that I think are really should be priorities for creating gender equality across Aotearoa. The ones that I want to bring up today are focusing on the unpaid care and domestic work. I think there's a real opportunity there to make some huge change, and maybe not too slowly. Also pay transparency, as we've talked about, flexible working, and then the fourth one is diversity on boards and where those people are making decisions. So I'll share some ways in which I've found progress can be made, but I'm talking about it from more an organisational change level, with a little bit of legislative change, but more at that organisational level, but I think it crosses over very much. So the thing that I think is the most important is to really find that emotional investment of those people who are holding the power, whoever's making the decisions. And at the moment in Aotearoa, most of the people making decisions, not all, but most of the people making those decisions are men and are Pākehā men. Not always, as I said, I don't want to get myself in trouble, but that's the case. And so although I'd like to think that everyone in power wants to make decisions because it's the right thing to do for everyone, what I've found is that you really need to find that emotional attachment for someone to be able to get them very much connected with what's going on, and to make them really invest in helping to progress change. So I'd like to remember, so the main thing that I think we can focus on around that is around parental leave. Now, there's so much research around parental leave, and what I think needs to happen is for there to be legislative change in terms of taking parental leave. Now, this is one step, and then it can have a bigger impact on the rest of gender roles in terms of caring and unpaid work. It's done in a lot of Scandinavian countries and a few others where there's allocated parental leave specifically for fathers, so that it can't be passed on to the mother of a child. It has to be taken by the father, and then if it's not, it just doesn't get taken, which has had a huge impact on gender roles within these countries. They're way more divided, and it changes all of society. So it's really blurred that sort of gender roles in terms of unpaid work and care, which has then really impacted gender equality within workplaces as well. So even that out. So that's what. So and to get people emotionally invested in that, there are a few ways that I find works. One of them is I remember reading an article which I always think back to. It was about 15 years ago around. This is a bit random, but around a nurse who was interviewing people when they were on their deathbeds, and she was asking them about their regrets. And the main regret that all of them had was not spending as much time with their families, mostly men saying that. So although it was 15 years ago, I think that's still really probably very relevant now. So using that to say, look, you've got an amazing opportunity right now to reflect, especially after COVID, where a lot of fathers have been spending a little bit more time with their children, not necessarily equally, but a bit more time to go, look, you don't want to have those regrets. Look, you've made it work over these last few months. There's a whole lot of other research to show that in heterosexual two-parent families, if the parenting is shared, relationships are much better, sex life is much better, child development is better, and there's a lot of it. Also obviously better for the mother in terms of career development, so overall better financially for the whole whānau. So there are lots of positives in terms of influencing those people making the decisions to go, actually, there are lots of things that you could be doing that'll benefit you and your whānau as well as the wider wider society. The other thing which a lot of people seem to connect to is positively impacting their daughters or maybe their partners, but it's usually the daughter thing that I hear. So people saying, I realized that I needed to be part of this when my daughter reached the age of however, and experienced some sort of discrimination. So finding that emotional connection there. And the third one that I think is quite helpful as well is connecting it to positive masculinity as well. So thinking about the sort of culture we have, especially within sort of rugby, that men have to be tough and men, and they can't cry, and they can't go and seek help if they've got a medical issue, and they've got to be the breadwinners, and the absolute pressure on men to be in these positions where they can't show any sort of emotional vulnerability, they can't go and get their health checked out, and they have to make money to support their whānau. So there are all these positives for everyone, rather than just promoting gender equality as a good thing for women. It is actually so beneficial for everyone, and I think that's the point, that we can really create some change in society, both at a cultural level, at an organisational level, and a legislative level, because that's where people making those decisions and are in the positions of power can really feel connected to it and help to make the change. If you look at boards across Aotearoa, most of them are made up of men. Systems are originally created for them, and it's actually really slow progress if you're just involving women to try and push change. So although I'm absolutely a fan of pushing the Equal Pay Amendment bill and pay transparency, I think that the parental leave and that unpaid care and domestic work is really the place where there could be some really real progress, and maybe faster progress than just looking at equal pay. Just a few other things that I think what I found working with organisations is really working well is to take away that myth that you either have to choose between making profit or working on diversity and inclusion. And I think this is really key at the moment, where a lot of organisations are thinking, how do we get through COVID? And some organisations have scrapped their diversity and inclusion roles. A lot of organisations are saying, well, this is not a priority for us. We just need to focus on continuing to make a profit or getting through COVID. And actually, it doesn't have to be like that. Diversity and inclusion does make money. So it's really making sure that that is a priority for organisations, no matter what type of organisation, to really get through COVID. Last couple of things, sharing stories I think is an absolute key way to also get that emotional investment for people. So this is creating change at any level again. So finding those stories. So I've heard a lot of stories of fathers during COVID spending some really quality time with their children. I've heard stories around people who sit, on boards or in governance roles, and how they've been welcomed and felt like they've been part of a change. I've heard stories around organisations that, without any legislative change, have put those things in place to create pay transparency, and around flexible working, so people don't feel there's such a divide between what they're doing at home and what they're doing at work. So I think sharing real personal stories is really key as well, and involving those intersectional voices like Julianne touched on. So really making sure that it's not just looked at as women in general, sometimes it is, but also looking at the voices of young women, the voices of Māori, Pasifika, Asian, trans women, and making sure all those voices are given a place to share. At the end of the day, though, I think, although it's really important to make individual and organisational change, it's really individualised depending. So you know, Westpac are lucky to have David because he's passionate about this, but that's just, you know, the people at the top making those decisions really influence who's doing what. So it needs to be legislated to make sure that no one's discriminated against. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you, Zoe. So we've got a few questions that have come through, and what I think I'll do in this last period of time that we have is I'm going to group a couple of them together, present them to the panel, and then ask you to all answer them as you can, using a couple of minutes, right? So the first two that have come up that are sort of combined. The first one speaks to the segregation issue again, around in a couple of ways. So how do we get more young women into apprenticeships in fields that they might not otherwise gravitate to? Or how does education in co-ed schools work to support girls who may aspire to STEM subjects but might not otherwise get access, get the same kinds of education that girls get in single-sex schools? And just more generally, how do we think, when we're thinking about valuing male jobs and making comparisons with male jobs or male-dominated jobs, this process of making comparisons is really arduous. Laura's, you've really presented that for us. And so there are sort of two questions here that go to why aren't we just able to value the work that women do in these professions intrinsically in a way that the monetary value reflects what it's worth to our economy and societal well-being without needing to compare it to a sort of a male norm job. But also, David, what kinds of internal comparisons might you be able to do in your organisation that help break down that divide you talked about between high-level clerical administrative work and, say, IT or those other sorts of male-dominated jobs? And Zoe, just before, just so that you get to have a say on something as well, I just want to add that I was in Sweden when the baby month, the mandatory baby, I was doing my research on paid parental leave and other things, and the daddy month for taking parental leave, the guys used to take it to go moose hunting. So they had to legislate and require, that families would lose it if the guys didn't take it, because they would take it during moose hunting season and go moose hunting. So just an anecdotal aside as to why sometimes these things need a bit of regulation. So Loris, maybe I'll get you to start, if that's okay, and talk us through some of the things around comparisons, but also thinking about dismantling segregation, if there's a way through this. Maybe something came up in the interviews that you do when you're talking to the people who are giving evidence for you.
Kia ora, Jennifer. When you mentioned co-ed schools and single-sex schools and so on, I went to single-sex school, and I often think in those situations that for a lot of single-sex schools, the choices are quite limited because they invariably are smaller, unless you go to a bigger city school. But if you were in a boarding school like I was, they were way smaller. So if you are going to look at changing roles, I think you have to be quite deliberate about them. That when someone shows some interest in something that is out of the norm, then the supposed authorities have to take that on board straight away and actually pursue that, as opposed to saying that, thinking of it as don't be silly. You can never be doing that because this is the way the world turns. If you're from a family that is, and like we often talk about now, if you weren't a teacher, what would you have been? And it's amazing the number of people that come back with the different things. I wanted to be a florist. I wanted to be a farmer. But of course, those weren't in the picture at the time, because you were said quite clearly, this is the road you will be going on, and this is, and as parents, that's our job to do that, to actually broaden and also in our broadening things for our children, to actually don't confine them to the space in our own heads of what we believe that is best for our children. And I know in Māoridom, often that's the way we do things, is this is what you will do, and this is what you will do, and this is what the other child will do. But sometimes our children just don't fit into any of those squares. And you talked a little bit about the comparators. Totally agree with the people that say, why not just value the work intrinsically? But, you know, when you're proving a point to a system that actually says we are not giving you this unless you can prove beyond a shadow of doubt all of these things, those are the hoops that we had to jump through. And it appeared to me that the hoops got more and more and more as we went along. However, we did reach the end of the hurdle jumping and completed it for teachers' aides. But I totally agree. Why not? The people have said this is what they do, and everyone can see, and the evidence is there. Why not just take it as read?
Kia ora, thank you. David, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. The question, I think that was posted there by Carol, can we look internally and say, are we valuing, work appropriately, regardless of gender? And we have had a look at that, and we can't find big areas of opportunity. I think mainly because most roles in the bank are generally sort of within the world of clerical administrative type of roles, and layer by layer it kind of gets paid more as you require more training for the role. You might have had 3 years training versus none, versus a few weeks or something. Or there's more level of responsibility and risk being taken. And I think this is, for us, I feel as though we're in a situation where traditionally women who left school without maybe a tertiary qualification ended up in a service industry type role, whereas men in that category ended up maybe in a labouring sort of construction manufacturing type role, and we're sort of representative of that. But one thing I do think that is slightly a worry for me with COVID is that a lot of the roles in the bank performed by women historically were kind of transaction processing roles, so people coming into branches with making a deposit or cashing a check or something. That kind of thing has been on a track of digitization, so customers don't have to come into a branch anymore and do that. And COVID's kind of accelerated that because bank branches weren't really open during the lockdown, and guess what? Everyone kind of coped with it. So a lot of those roles are kind of going, and they're turning into digital sort of roles, and we might be hiring a few more software engineers and other things to make up for it, but not nearly in the same numbers. And many of the roles that are going to be sort of affected by that change are going to be roles traditionally carried out by women. So I think this occupational segregation thing is kind of, you can look within your organisation, but in our case we haven't found much for it. But I think it's something that's actually New Zealand as a whole society has to deal with. It's the education system, and it's everyone working together on that.
Thank you. Zoe, did you want to come in here?
Kia ora. Just a couple of things. I wanted to go back, Jennifer, to what you first were saying about schools and how they're trying to get more women into STEM subjects. I do know that there's been a huge push over the last few years for this to happen, or more like last 5 years. There are organizations like Girl Boss, there are organizations like Women in Trades, and plenty of others that are working both in high schools and in universities to really feed those women who are showing signs of being interested in it, as well as getting young women interested in it to really try and change the workforce. So although it's not a change overnight, there are a lot of things that are happening and clubs that young people can join to really try and change. So I think that's something we'll see more in the next sort of 5 or 10 years, hopefully. And then I just wanted to go to a question that Lisa has asked in the Q&A around women going back into the workforce after taking time off to care. And absolutely, Lisa, there's a lot of research around to show that is a real place where there's that discrimination and gap in terms of career and pay. There's also lots of research that has come out more recently to say that that transition back into the workforce after either taking parental leave or taking extended leave is some of the hardest time that anyone can take, both for people of any gender. That transition back into work is where there are really high levels of depression, anxiety. So I think in terms of that, there is a huge area that needs to be looked at. I think overall changing that sort of gendering role around parenting and making it a more of a collective role in terms of parenting will have a difference in that. I think really looking at the value of parenting, it's really not valued at the moment and thought of as not really a job and people taking time off, etc. So changing that stigma of parenting as in just watching TV and going for coffees would have a massive impact on that. And then I think organisations need to be doing a lot of work for understanding, acknowledging, and then putting support in place for when people are returning for the 6 months when they get back to work, and then also providing flexibility as well. So part-time roles, shorter days, any flexibility that will work for whatever that family needs, and it'll be different for different people. But yes, I agree. There needs to be more of a focus around that transition back into the workplace.
Great, thank you. So I'm conscious of time. One thing I would just follow up before I give you all 1 minute, a wrap up, is people are asking questions about why, if you work from home remotely, the gender gap may be exacerbated. So the report that I looked at from the US is relatively recent, and I don't think we've done enough of a deep dive into this for sure yet to know for sure the reasons. But as Zoe mentioned, the valuing of the unpaid care work that gets done, not just of children, but of elderly parents, for some of us who are now moving into that generation, is quite significant and not shared evenly. But what the report did say is that when you work from home, so there already exists, and we know this from some of the Ministry for Women's work on the motherhood penalty. So women who have children get there is a penalty for becoming a mother that plays out in pay terms. For fathers, it's called a fatherhood bonus. So if you have children as men, this adds in a way to the way in which you are seen and the value, attitudinally at least. Now, extrapolating from that, the report suggests that motherhood penalty and fatherhood bonus, when fathers work from home, they're almost given an extra tick, if you like, for being prepared to work from home, because the assumption is that they are now engaging in more of the fatherhood work, whereas it may also exacerbate the motherhood penalty that it pre-exists remote working. So just putting that out there for those of you that were asking that question. But I want to finish with a question that's more at the level of the living wage, which people have raised in the questions and our speakers have too. And one person also asked about unionisation. So we know that we have this system that shares the benefits of what gets negotiated through the union movement and so on. But how do we work to ensure that the living wage is something that is collective across our labour market? But also, how do we work to get women's unionisation rates up, particularly if they're working part-time or working from home? How does unionisation happen in that environment? And so I'm going to give everybody like 1 minute to answer that, and then we'll come back to sign off. So Laura, I'll start with you.
Right, unionising from while you're at home. Actually, I was thinking while you were talking about that situation for during lockdown, and actually sitting at home myself, you know, niece over there on her computer, me over here on my computer, husband over there on his computer, all adults, of course, which is a whole different scenario from a mum and 2 or 3 children that are in that situation. And certainly mum wouldn't have time to focus totally on their computer doing the work that's necessary for the company that they work for. The child is there as well all the time, needing to be talked to. Unionisation of those people, is that what they're talking about, that possibility of online?
Or just generally, like in the sense of if being in a union is likely to lead to better pay, or more likely to
say yes. Of course, I would say yes. I work for the union. What I would say is that in the teacher's aid situation that's just passed, it's shown all of us to actually work together for a common good, and that's the whole idea of unions. But obviously not the whole world believes in the same thing, but moving forward in working together, if we have everyone working together to a common cause, like the living wage, and David said, you know, Westpac has actually taken on the living wage as a premise that they are promoting. Company by company, you can actually see all the people who have taken up the living wage because it's advertised, it's out there, and actually the people who aren't taking up the living wage only needs to talk to people like that, and actually, you know, being given an option that it isn't something that is going to put your, well, it might now after COVID, of course, but it's not going to put your firm in dire straits if you do it over a period of time. You just have to be prepared for it.
Kia ora, thank you. David?
Yes, I think, you know, when you sort of say that there's so many stakeholders in society, the workers need to have a voice at the table, and the union is the right place to do it. My only concern is I think the unions themselves and the union movement and our approach to unions has to also evolve. And I think we're still stuck in pretty much a 19th century British sort of you know, approach to unionism. In my case, we have quite a unionised workforce, but I only ever seem to talk to the union when there's a problem, or when we're doing a pay round negotiation and we're haggling over, you know, the last few sort of fractions of a percent. My concern is that there are far bigger issues in society about the future of work, about the kind of things we're talking about here, than just a few percentage points on the wage round. I would love to see a union and employer relationship that was far more like the Scandinavian or German sort of models, where we're actually coming together to solve big problems as sort of equals in the thing. So I think I'm definitely up for that, but I do think that we all need to sort of grow into a more mature model, and we should not just follow, as I said, the sort of British tradition, but, you know, some of these other more European ones.
Kia ora, thank you. Zoe?
Kia ora. I'm definitely no union specialist, but I am part of one and I absolutely support them. I know that in my role at the ADHB, some of the work that we do with the unions is similar to what you explained, David. So we actually have a really positive working relationship with some of the unions, not all of them, and it's working together for the common good of the people and trying to, and you're right, it's often when there is a problem, but I feel like things are changing, and that we are moving, although not fast enough, but moving to a place where it can be everyone working together as, you know, as one for people, rather than the union against the employer butting heads all the time.
Kia ora. Well, there are other questions that are sitting in our text box, so we'll gather those up and you'll be able and share them with you and with the Minister. To all our audience, or those that are left, just want to let you know that you'll receive a follow-up message from us with a link to this recording. as well as information on our 3rd and possibly 4th Gender Impact Analysis Forum. So for those of you interested in how we're going to get more women into retraining and apprenticeships, that's one of our next Gender Impact Analysis Forum. So, and we're also going to be running one on the paid, unpaid, valuing unpaid work nexus with paid work. So those 2 coming up over the next couple of months, and you'll be, for those of you that have registered for this one, you'll get more information on that. But for now, it's time to say goodbye. Kia ora. I'd really like to thank on our 69 down from 130 participants, to our 4 speakers this afternoon. Kia ora, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. See you anon.